On the 2nd of January, the Trump administration launched a dramatic raid into Venezuela, forcibly bringing the country's brutal dictator to the US to face trial. But after the raid came, to me, something more shocking: Trump's press conference.
We are going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition.
Trump, the man supposedly against the forever wars and regime change, talked openly about running Venezuela and extracting its oil wealth.
We're going to be taking out a tremendous amount of wealth out of the ground.
Since he's taken power again, Trump's foreign policy has felt much more aggressive, attacking not only old enemies like Iran and ramping up tensions against Latin American countries, but even being aggressive against allies like Denmark. And now we've had this act of war, effectively kidnapping a foreign head of state with little justification but self-interest. And since then, we've had hints or actual threats of military action against Colombia, Cuba, Mexico, Iran, Greenland, and Venezuela. Again, what is going on and what is behind all this? Trump has talked openly about making money from the country's oil, but many experts think this is unlikely to work. And the other reasons he's given, from a crackdown on drugs to the need to enforce a Monroe Doctrine, also seem to not quite fit the facts. Meanwhile, critics have speculated this raid was just an attempt to distract from Trump's domestic problems, which, if any of these theories, is correct. On this channel, I look at the ideas that explain the news, and so in this video, I want to look at what's driving this for Trump. In doing this, I think we can understand not just this episode and what might happen next, but also get an understanding of the bigger picture and what animates Trump's entire presidency. Before I start all that, I'd love to point you towards my Substack email list, which is a free way to get an email whenever I make a new video. I also send out regular emails of interesting links of what I'm reading and watching, and to paying supporters, there's tips for filmmakers, behind the scenes notes, and now I'm also showing videos in which I talk about other things I'm noticing in the news and generally show people around my life a bit. As you might know, YouTube ads don't pay a lot of money, so I meet the costs by doing other video work, sponsorships, and through the support of viewers like you. And so if you would like to support the work I'm doing, then I would really appreciate it. One argument from the administration was that this raid into Venezuela was really about drugs.
The kingpin of a vast criminal network responsible for trafficking colossal amounts of deadly and illicit drugs into the United States.
The precedent often mentioned here is the 1989 operation in Panama, when US forces went in and arrested General Manuel Noriega, put him on trial for drug offences, and he spent the rest of his life locked up. But while it's likely true Maduro was involved with drug trafficking, there are a lot of problems with believing this is the motivation behind this raid. First, although the US has a drug overdose problem, it's mainly a fentanyl problem, and most of what comes out of Venezuela is cocaine headed for Europe. Also, Trump just pardoned the previous Honduran president, Hernandez, who was serving a 45-year sentence for drug trafficking. Why do that if you care so much about drugs? Okay, so let's put that idea to one side. Another motivation for this kind of operation might be humanitarian intervention, a way to free the Venezuelan people from an evil dictator. This concept of humanitarian intervention became popular in the 1990s, when the international community felt unable to intervene in a series of genocides and conflicts because of the idea of sovereignty, the principle that no country should interfere in the internal affairs of another. In 1999, British Prime Minister Tony Blair gave a speech where he argued there should be limits to this principle.
Non-interference has long been considered an important principle of international order, and I do not suggest that we jettison it lightly. But the principle of non-interference must be qualified in important respects. Acts of genocide can never be a purely internal matter.
1999 was the same year that Western powers successfully intervened in Kosovo to prevent ethnic cleansing of ethnic Albanians. And the idea also drew prestige from America's successful nation-building projects following the Second World War. This idea was also part of the justification, along with self-defense against chemical and biological weapons, of the invasion of Iraq in 2003.
You deserve to live as free people, and I assure every citizen of Iraq, your nation will soon be free.
However, the Iraq invasion ended in a messy civil war and quagmire, and the idea, along with phrases like nation-building, was discredited. And yet, this action in Venezuela is clearly not humanitarian intervention. In fact, what was striking about Trump's comments after the raid is that he hardly mentioned democracy or used humanitarian arguments to excuse violating Venezuela's sovereignty. In fact, rather than call on the leader with most proven support to take over, Trump discredited her.
I think it would be very tough for her to be the leader. She doesn't have the support within, or the respect within the country. She's a very nice woman, but she doesn't have the respect to be the leader.
Apparently annoyed she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize instead of him. In fact, far from being helpful to the people of Venezuela, the situation for them so far looks like it's got worse, with the regime ratcheting up repression. Okay, so while this was an intervention, it definitely wasn't humanitarian. But maybe a version of this idea might be surviving under Marco Rubio?
He really wants to do regime change in Cuba. That's sort of, I think, his overriding goal. And I would say that he almost has a kind of reverse domino theory.
The domino theory was the Cold War idea that communism would spread from one country to another.
And I'd say that Rubio holds this sort of idea in reverse, meaning that if he thinks he can topple one kind of vaguely left-coded regime in Latin America, this is Venezuela, then that will make it easier to topple the next one.
Supporting this theory is the fact that Marco Rubio, whose parents are Cuban exiles, has long wanted the Cuban regime to fall, with speculation the loss of Venezuelan oil will now help that.
There's no way that the communist dictatorship in Cuba survives after the takedown of Maduro. It is over.
But I'm not sure this theory really explains what's happened either, as nothing has really changed in Venezuela. Despite Trump's comments, there has been no regime change in Venezuela, with Maduro's vice president taking over. A lady once described as Maduro's torture czar. An embargo and threat of kidnap might pressure the regime to give up some oil fields, but it's not going to change its nature, and nor, without some other kind of action, is it going to change the nature of the regime in Cuba either. Another thing this is definitely not is America First isolationism.
And I have been forced to the conclusion that we cannot win this war for England regardless of how much assistance we send. That is why the America First Committee has been formed.
The phrase America First was prominent during the Second World War when isolationists wanted to keep America out of that conflict. That movement died when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor and America entered the war. But when Trump revived the phrase, it seemed like a new isolationism, a desire to avoid military action overseas. Well, that definitely feels like something of the past. The idea that Trump is the peacemaker-in-chief was already under strain in his first term, when he ordered missile strikes and assassinations, but Trump certainly no longer feels like a president avoiding foreign entanglements. Okay, so we've covered some ideas I think we can easily chuck out, but now I want to cover some which I think have some more plausibility. First is the theory that this is all a distraction from an ailing economy and the ongoing embarrassment of the Epstein files. The idea that leaders use wars or foreign policy crises to distract from domestic problems feels intuitive. In fact, there's a whole movie based on the premise called Wag the Dog.
Now, Washington's top spin doctor
We can distract the press for 11 days till the election. I think we got a chance.
has an idea.
We can't afford a war.
We're gonna have the appearance of a war.
It tells the story of a political spin doctor hiring a Hollywood producer to fake a whole foreign policy crisis to boost his candidate. And it's certainly true that Trump doesn't want the media to be talking about the Epstein files, so let's leave that idea on the table. Next, let's look at an idea that Trump himself has said has been very influential.
The Monroe Doctrines. And the Monroe Doctrine is a big deal, but we've superseded it by a lot.
The Monroe Doctrine dates from 1823, when the US president of the day demanded European colonial powers keep out of the Western Hemisphere. One interesting thing to note is that at this stage it wasn't about the US dominating the whole hemisphere, it was about stopping other powers from dominating. In fact, the doctrine came up during a confrontation with Venezuela in 1895, but it wasn't used to explain a US intervention, but to stop an intervention, at that time from Britain. Sorry Venezuela. Later, in the 1900s, President Teddy Roosevelt made the doctrine more domineering, saying the US had the right to step in as an international police power. And over the coming years, even if the doctrine wasn't always officially invoked, the US intervened repeatedly in countries throughout Latin America. A globalized version of this doctrine is the concept of spheres of influence, a term first used in the late 1800s, when European powers were carving up territories like China and Africa into different areas of control. The Monroe Doctrine went out of fashion after the Cold War, but it has re-emerged with a vengeance under Trump, most clearly in the recent national security strategy, which explicitly said the United States will reassert and enforce the Monroe Doctrine to restore American preeminence in the Western Hemisphere. Trump's administration taking an idea from the time of empires and bringing it into the 21st century. This concept seems to explain a lot. Trump's aggression towards Latin American countries, his desire for Canada to become a 51st state, and his attempts to buy Greenland. It also could explain why he's relaxed about Putin's invasion of Ukraine, it's their backyard after all, and suggests America will not support Taiwan if it's invaded by China.
The United States is using its military to secure our interests unapologetically in our hemisphere. We're a superpower, and under President Trump, we are going to conduct ourselves as a superpower.
Okay, so again, let's leave this idea on the table for now. Next, let's look at the thing that Trump said most motivated him in this action.
We're going to have presence in Venezuela as it pertains to oil. We're going to get the oil flowing the way it should be. We're going to be taking out a tremendous amount of wealth out of the ground.
Comments like these are why I found the press conference more shocking than the actual raid. During the Iraq War, protesters often talked about how the invasion was really about going after the country's oil wealth. No blood for oil was the phrase. In fact, the pursuit of oil is a popular left-wing theory of all US conflict. Personally, from what I've read of the histories, oil doesn't seem to have been the determining factor in Iraq or many of the other conflicts that commentators often talk about. And even if it was, it didn't exactly work out. In fact, the failure to get oil was one of Donald Trump's objections to the Iraq War.
You said, we should have kept the oil, but okay, maybe we'll have another chance. What did you mean by that?
Well, we should have kept the oil when we got out. And you know, it's very interesting. Had we taken the oil, you wouldn't have ISIS. Because they fuel themselves with the oil. That's where they got the money.
So you believe we can go in and take the oil?
We should have taken the oil.
But now with Venezuela, he's not going to make the same mistake.
We need total access. We need access to the oil.
On this account, the idea behind Trump's actions is basically imperialism. America is a powerful country and will go and take what it wants from weaker countries.
You can talk all you want about international niceties and everything else, but we live in a world, in the real world, Jake, that is governed by strength, that is governed by force, that is governed by power.
There's lots that could be said about this. It's obviously a rejection of international law and the world order that was set up after the carnage and disaster of World War II and to prevent the nuclear destruction of a third.
Had this charter a few years ago, and above all the will to use it, millions now dead would be alive. If we should falter in the future in our will to use it, millions now living will surely die.
The administration calls international law international niceties, but of course misses the fact that this is a pragmatic system that works ultimately in America's self-interest. But I think the thing I find most depressing about this is how it diminishes America. As we've seen, America has a long history of self-interested military action in Latin America and across the world, but its motivations have normally also included, or at least pretended to include, moral justifications for what it's doing, and have often led to real good. But Trump is rejecting all that to say it's just about strength and taking from a weaker country, when even Putin, when he's doing his imperialism, at least pretends to dress it up as self-defense or he's protecting ethnic Russians or whatever. Supporters will say Trump's just being honest, and critics will no doubt find it quite satisfying to have things just admitted to openly. But personally, I find it sad to find America declaring the principle of its foreign policy as, well, theft. Okay, let's see where we've got to. I'm saying the raid wasn't about drugs, it wasn't motivated by humanitarian concerns, it wasn't America First isolationism, and the idea of reverse domino theory is let down by the fact no real regime change has actually happened. And I think that last point, that nothing of substance has really happened, is relevant to the other ideas we've been exploring. For example, let's take Trump's view of all this, that it's an imperial project to get Venezuela's oil. Well, there's already been quite a lot of reporting on how this will be difficult to achieve. Getting Venezuela's oil flowing would need billions of dollars of investment, take years to pay off, oil prices are currently low, and this is in an environment when the political risk for oil companies would be high, with Trump gone in 3 short years and the regime that stole America's oil still in place. Also, Trump seems to have a very simplistic view of how oil wealth, or any wealth, really happens. What made Venezuela rich in the past wasn't just owning the oil, it was the rule of law and other institutions that helped investment thrive. I mean, it feels like Trump can't even do imperialism right. This is why I find it hard, even though Trump is boasting about this is all about oil and taking stuff, to think of this as an imperial project. Any political project, any sustained effort to change the world through policy requires a commitment and attention span that I don't think Trump has. When journalists asked what's next for Venezuela at that press conference, I honestly think Trump hadn't even thought about it before that moment.
That would run Venezuela.
Well, it's largely going to be, for a period of time, the people that are standing right behind me. We're going to be running it. We're going to be bringing it back. It's a dead, I talk about a dead country. A year and a half ago, we were a dead country. Now we're the hottest country anywhere in the world.
What happens is that Trump does something, and then those around him scramble to make it substantial. The media, supporters, and critics do the same thing, projecting plans and ideas onto Trump, when I don't think they exist. Another recent example was when his tariffs crashed the stock market, and supporters argued it was a genius mastermind plot to devalue the dollar or something. Even the distraction theory presumes a kind of planning going on, which there probably isn't. I also think this is a reason to doubt that Trump is guided by a Monroe Doctrine. It seems to me the causality is backwards. He's not following a doctrine, he's just adopting it because it happens to match what he wants to do anyway. If there wasn't a doctrine, he'd just do the same thing, which is whatever he happens to think of that day. I'm not sure any of these ideas do a good job of explaining Trump. Trump's projects, such as they are money for him, his family, and his supporters, attention, a never-ending desire to keep eyeballs on the Trump TV show, and power, or the appearance of power. That's the best way, I think, to understand the Venezuela raid, an attention-grabbing spectacle that makes him feel and look powerful. And that's all his foreign policy, in fact. Assassinating a general, bombing a mountain nuclear facility, kidnapping a foreign leader, they have more in common with Trump's desire to rename buildings after himself or build himself a triumphal arch than they do the consequential foreign policy actions of past US presidents. I think this also explains Ukraine, where his support for Russia is often attributed to his love of strongman dictators or business interests. But I think it's more about just what's quick and easy. To get a proper peace between Russia and Ukraine requires patience and sustained policy making. Much easier to pressure Ukraine, a country you have influence over, into surrendering. This is why actually Denmark can probably relax about Greenland, as acquiring the territory would, I think, require a sustained application of thought and action, while Trump is capable of just quick-fire stunts. After all, as we've seen, it's striking how little has really changed in Venezuela. There are projects in the Trump presidency, but they tend to be other people's. Elon Musk's Doge that caused a lot of noise and opposition, but very few savings. Netanyahu's plan to end Iran's weapons program that didn't end its weapons program. Or Stephen Miller's immigration obsession that has already cost Republicans so much support. But even these projects are often undermined by the president's own short attention span. Trump is a social media algorithm in a suit, constantly moving, ever-changing TV show that goes nowhere. The result is a presidency that does a lot of damage, but it's ultimately inconsequential. Hi, thanks for watching. As I said earlier, please do check out my Substack email list for free emails updating you when I publish and other goodies. Otherwise, check out the other video YouTube is recommending right now, or I will see you in the next one.